An immigrant janitor returned a lost wallet, not realizing its owner would change his family's fate. This simple act of honesty, performed without expectation of reward, was one of the countless small kindnesses Alejandro Reyes had offered to the world during his 15 years in America. But this time, though he couldn't possibly know it that rainy Tuesday morning, everything would be different. The fluorescent lights of Oakwood Tower's lobby buzzed overhead as Alejandro guided his mop across the marble floor in methodical figure eights. His calloused hands, marked by years of manual labor, gripped the wooden handle with the practiced ease of a man who had long ago accepted his place in the world. 52 years old, with salt and pepper hair and eyes that had seen too much hardship to sparkle anymore, he moved through the pre-dawn quiet like a ghost, present but unseen. 3 floors above, in the executive bathroom Alejandro would clean in approximately 47 minutes, a black leather wallet sat forgotten beside a sink. Its owner was already halfway to the airport, oblivious to its absence. Outside, Boston shivered under November's first frost. The windows of the tower reflected the city's twinkling lights, a beautiful view that Alejandro rarely noticed anymore. Once, years ago, the sight had filled him with hope. America, the land of opportunity, where his children would have the chances he never did. Now, 15 years later, those same lights merely marked the hours of his labor, from the darkness of his arrival at 4 a.m. to the darkness of his departure at noon. "Morning, Al," called the night security guard Jerome as he prepared to end his shift. He was one of the few who acknowledged Alejandro's existence in this building of important people, rushing to important meetings. "Good morning, Mr. Jerome," Alejandro replied with a slight nod, his English still carrying the musical cadence of his native Guatemala. He never dropped the Mr., a small courtesy that cost him nothing but preserved the dignity he had been taught to show others. Jerome paused by the door, hugging his coat closer. "Cold one today. You got your layers?" Alejandro smiled faintly. "Yes. My daughter, Lucia, she made me take extra sweater." He patted his chest where beneath his gray uniform, a hand-knit sweater kept him warm. "She worries too much." What Alejandro didn't say was that the extra sweater was Lucia's way of caring for him, because she couldn't do more. At 19, his brilliant daughter had deferred her college dreams to work at a local diner, helping to support the family after his wife's illness had drained their meager savings. The scholarship letters, once proudly displayed on their refrigerator, were now tucked away in a drawer. Promises postponed but not forgotten. "Smart girl," Jerome said, then waved goodbye. "See you tomorrow, Alan." The minutes ticked by as Alejandro moved through his routine, a ballet of cleaning and polishing he could perform with his eyes closed. By 6 a.m., he had reached the executive floors, where the offices were larger, the trash cans filled with expensive coffee cups, and the bathrooms stocked with lotions and mouthwash his family could never afford. When he pushed his cart into the executive bathroom on the 14th floor, he didn't immediately notice the wallet. His mind was elsewhere, on his wife Maria's doctor appointment that afternoon, on whether they could afford the new medication the specialist had mentioned last time, on Lucia's tired eyes when she'd returned from her double shift the night before. The wallet sat there, black leather against white porcelain, like a full stop in the middle of a sentence. Alejandro stared at it for a long moment before picking it up. It was heavy, expensive, the kind of wallet carried by men who never worried about what was inside it. He didn't open it immediately. That wasn't his way. Instead, he slipped it into his pocket and continued cleaning. He would turn it into security when he finished his floor, as he had done with forgotten scarves, umbrellas, and once, a diamond earring that had earned him a grudging nod from the head of security, but nothing more. 2 hours later, wallet delivered to the security desk with nothing more than a quiet explanation of where he'd found it, Alejandro continued his rounds. He thought little of the incident. It was merely another item in the lost and found box of his life. In another part of the city, Richard Harrington paced the boarding area of Gate C-17 at Logan International Airport, patting his empty pocket for the 10th time. The wallet was definitely gone. With it, his credit cards, driver's license, and, most importantly, the business cards and notes for the biggest presentation of his career. At 55, Richard was a man accustomed to control, to preparation, to success. This loss threatened all three. Final boarding call for Flight 1082 to San Francisco, the gate attendant announced, her voice professionally pleasant. Richard ran a hand through his silver-streaked hair and made a decision. The presentation was too important. He would have to reschedule his flight, find his wallet, and regroup. With a sharp gesture of frustration, he stepped away from the line and pulled out his phone. 3 calls later, he had canceled his flight, reported his missing wallet to his assistant, and was in a taxi heading back to Oakwood Tower. His assistant had already called building security, who confirmed that yes, a wallet had been turned in that morning by one of the cleaning staff. Which one? Richard had asked, not because he cared about the identity of the person, but because precision was his nature. The immigrant gentleman works the morning shift. Alejandro something, his assistant had replied. Now, as the taxi wove through Boston's congested streets, Richard found himself wondering about this Alejandro. In 15 years of working at Oakwood Tower, Richard had never paid attention to the cleaning staff. They were background fixtures, like the potted plants in the lobby or the abstract paintings in the hallways, present but unremarkable. When Richard arrived at Oakwood Tower, he was directed to the security desk, where his wallet waited in a sealed envelope. He opened it quickly, verifying that everything was there: credit cards, ID, and, most crucially, his notes. Relief washed over him, followed immediately by the urgent need to return to the airport and catch the next flight to San Francisco. But something made him pause. The person who found this, Alejandro, is he still here? The security guard checked his watch. Should be on the 8th floor about now. Finishes his shift at noon. Richard hesitated. He was not a man given to spontaneous detours. His life ran on schedules, on 5-year plans, on carefully plotted trajectories toward clearly defined goals. But today, having narrowly avoided disaster, he felt a strange impulse. I'd like to thank him personally. Minutes later, Richard found himself in an unfamiliar part of his very familiar building, searching for a man he had never noticed. He found Alejandro emptying trash cans in a row of cubicles, moving quietly, efficiently, invisibly among the office workers who never looked up from their screens. "Excuse me," Richard said, his voice sounding unusually loud in the hushed environment. "Are you Alejandro, the gentleman who found my wallet?" Alejandro straightened, surprise flickering across his weathered face. "Yes, sir. I find in bathroom this morning." Richard extended his hand. "Richard Harrington, I wanted to thank you personally." Alejandro wiped his hand on his uniform before shaking Richard's, a gesture of consideration that didn't go unnoticed. "No need for thanks, Mr. Harrington. It's my job to keep things in order. Finding and returning a wallet with several $1,000s in cash and irreplaceable notes is hardly in a janitor's job description," Richard replied. He reached for his wallet, intending to offer a reward, the standard response in his world to exceptional service. But something in Alejandro's dignified stance made him hesitate. This wasn't a bellhop or a waiter. This was a man doing what he considered right, without expectation of reward. Richard found himself asking instead, "Could I buy you a coffee? Or lunch, perhaps?" The question seemed to surprise Alejandro as much as it surprised Richard himself. "Thank you, sir, but I finish work soon. Must go home to take my wife to doctor." "Is she ill?" Richard asked, the question slipping out before social constraints could stop it. A shadow passed over Alejandro's face. "Yes, many years now. Today is important appointment." Richard should have nodded, offered polite wishes for her health, and walked away. That's what the Richard Harrington of yesterday would have done. But today's Richard, perhaps shaken by his near miss with disaster, perhaps curious about this man who had helped him without knowing who he was, found himself saying, "Let me drive you there. It's the least I can do." Alejandro's refusal was immediate. No, bus is fine. Been taking bus for 15 years. "I insist," Richard said, surprising himself again. "I have a car and driver waiting." "Please." In the strange alchemy of that moment, a wealthy executive and an immigrant janitor standing among the trash cans and cleaning supplies of the 8th floor, something shifted. Alejandro saw not condescension in Richard's eyes, but genuine gratitude. And Richard, looking properly at Alejandro perhaps for the first time, saw not just a janitor, but a man with pride, dignity, and worries of his own. "Thank you," Alejandro said finally. "Would be very helpful today." And so, at noon, Richard Harrington found himself waiting in his company car as Alejandro Reyes, changed out of his uniform into neatly pressed but visibly worn clothes, slid somewhat uncomfortably into the leather seat beside him. "Where to?" Richard asked. "Boston Medical Center," Alejandro replied quietly. "Oncology department." The word hung in the air between them. Oncology. Cancer. A battlefield where Richard had stood once before, 3 years ago, when his wife Janet had fought and won against breast cancer. But Janet had fought with every resource money could buy. Top specialists, experimental treatments, private rooms, and a husband who could take unlimited time off work to be by her side. "Your wife, what kind of cancer?" Richard asked as the car merged into traffic. "Lymphoma," Alejandro answered. "Started 5 years ago. Was better, then came back last year." His hands folded neatly in his lap, tightened slightly. "Today we find out if new treatment is possible." Richard nodded, understanding the weight of such appointments. "I hope the news is good." The car fell silent. Outside, Boston rolled by, the gleaming financial district giving way to more modest neighborhoods. Richard noticed Alejandro glancing at his watch repeatedly. "Are we going to be late?" Richard asked. "No, but must pick up my daughter first. She meets us at hospital." Alejandro hesitated. She translates, "My English ... Medical words are difficult." Richard nodded, instructed his driver to make a detour, and settled back into the seat. This impromptu act of kindness was already taking more time than he'd anticipated, but he found he didn't mind. His next flight wasn't until that evening, and for once, his schedule seemed less important than the moment he was in. They found Lucia waiting outside a small diner, still wearing her waitress uniform, her young face tight with worry that softened when she saw her father. When Alejandro explained about Richard and the wallet, she regarded the executive with a mixture of gratitude and suspicion. "Thank you for helping my father," she said, her English perfect and unaccented. "But you really don't need to come into the appointment with us." "I wasn't planning to," Richard assured her as they drove the final blocks to the hospital. "I'll wait if that's all right. I'd like to know how things turn out." The look Lucia gave him was searching, as if trying to identify his motive. Richard wasn't sure he could have explained it himself. All he knew was that returning to his office, to his emails and conference calls, suddenly seemed less urgent than waiting to hear whether a stranger's wife would receive treatment for her cancer. While Alejandro and Lucia disappeared into the oncology department, Richard found himself in the hospital cafe, nursing a mediocre coffee and watching the clock. His assistant called twice. He kept the conversations brief. His mind kept returning to the image of Alejandro carefully wiping his hand before shaking Richard's, a gesture that spoke volumes about the man's character. An hour passed, then two. Richard was considering leaving, his good deeds surely fulfilled, when he saw them approaching across the cafe. Even before they reached him, he could read the verdict on their faces. Lucia's eyes were red-rimmed, and Alejandro walked with the stiff dignity of a man determined not to break. The news was not good, Alejandro said simply as they sat down. "Cancer has spread. Doctor says treatment exists, but..." He looked at his daughter. "Insurance won't cover the specific immunotherapy he recommends." Lucia finished, her voice clinical, but her hands trembling as she set her purse on the table. "It's experimental, which means it's expensive." She gave a small, bitter laugh. "Very expensive." Richard nodded, understanding immediately the cruel mathematics of their situation. "I'm sorry. We try something else," Alejandro said with forced optimism. "Doctor says other treatment's still possible. Not as good chance, but still chance." Lucia's jaw tightened, but she didn't contradict her father. Instead, she asked Richard, "Do you need a ride somewhere? We've taken enough of your time." "Actually," Richard said slowly, an idea forming, "I have a friend on the board of this hospital. I'd like to make a call if you don't mind waiting a bit longer." 20 minutes later, Richard returned to find them sitting in silence, Alejandro's hand covering his daughter's, both staring into untouched cups of coffee. "My friend Dr. Brennan is the head of oncology," Richard said without preamble. "He's agreed to review your wife's case personally. He's very interested in her participation in a clinical trial they're running for exactly this type of lymphoma." Lucia's head snapped up. "Clinical trial? But those are usually full. We've been trying to get Mom into one for months. This one just received expanded funding," Richard said. "Dr. Wanedawernum, Deborah Durham. Brennan would like to meet with all of you tomorrow to discuss whether your mother is eligible." The hope that bloomed on their faces made Richard's throat tighten unexpectedly. He wasn't a sentimental man. He made decisions based on data, on risk assessments, on cost-benefit analyses. But in that moment, he recognized that he was balancing a scale that had been unfairly weighted from the start. "Why would you do this?" Lucia asked, her voice somewhere between grateful and suspicious. "You don't even know us." Richard considered the question carefully. "Your father did something honest when no one was watching. That matters to me." He paused. "And sometimes the world is unfair in ways we can actually fix." The next day, Richard canceled his San Francisco trip entirely, something unprecedented in his career, to accompany the Reyes family to meet with Dr. Brennan. Maria Reyes was a small woman with Lucia's eyes and a quiet strength that reminded Richard of his own wife during her treatment. The language barrier dissolved under the weight of the moment. "Doctor," Brennan explaining the trial, the promising results in similar cases, the complete coverage of costs, the schedule of treatments that would begin the following week. When they emerged from the hospital into the weak November sunshine, Maria leaning on Alejandro's arm but with new hope brightening her face, Richard found himself invited to Sunday dinner, an invitation he surprised himself by accepting. The Reyes home was a small apartment in Dorchester, immaculately clean but crowded with the evidence of lives carefully lived within tight constraints. Photos covered the walls, Alejandro and Maria young and smiling on their wedding day, Lucia in cap and gown at her high school graduation, a teenage boy with Alejandro's serious eyes holding a soccer trophy. "My son Miguel," Alejandro explained, noticing Richard's gaze on the photo. "He is in California now. Scholarship for engineering." Pride filled his voice, but also longing. He wanted to come home when his mother got sick again, but we said no. His future is important. The dinner was simple but delicious. Maria, despite her illness, had insisted on cooking traditional Guatemalan dishes. Richard, accustomed to business dinners at Boston's finest restaurants, found himself enjoying the meal more than any he could remember in recent years. The conversation flowed more easily than he expected, ranging from Lucia's deferred college plans to Maria's garden on the apartment building's roof, where she grew herbs and vegetables during the summer months. "You had scholarship offers?" Richard asked Lucia as they ate Maria's handmade tamales. Lucia nodded, a flash of old pain crossing her face. "Boston University and Northeastern. For pre-med." She shrugged, aiming for casualness but missing. "They'll still be there when the time is right." Richard thought of his own daughter, Jennifer, the same age as Lucia, but studying at Stanford without a moment's financial worry. The contrast struck him with unexpected force. Here was a family that had done everything right, worked hard, stayed together, prioritized education, yet a single illness had derailed their American dream. As Richard prepared to leave that evening, Alejandro walked him to his car. The night was cold, their breath forming clouds in the frosty air. "Thank you," Alejandro said simply. "For everything," Richard shook his head. "I made a phone call. You're the one who's been holding your family together through all this." Alejandro looked up at the apartment windows, where lights glowed warm against the darkness. "Is what fathers do." He turned back to Richard. "You have children?" "A daughter," Richard replied. "Jennifer, she's at Stanford, and a son, Christopher, who's a junior in high school. You must be very proud." "I am," Richard said. Then with unexpected honesty, he added, "Though I sometimes wonder if I've been as present in their lives as I should have been." Alejandro nodded, understanding in his eyes. "Is hard, working all the time, trying to give them good life." "Yes," Richard agreed. "But I think maybe you've managed the balance better than I have." The two men stood in silence for a moment, these fathers from different worlds finding common ground in the universal desire to do right by their children. "Sunday dinners," Alejandro said finally. "Every week, no matter what. Even when working 3 jobs, I always come home for Sunday dinner." He smiled. "You come again sometime. Bring your family." The invitation, offered so genuinely, touched Richard unexpectedly. "I'd like that. Thank you." As Richard drove home that night to his spacious Beacon Hill townhouse, he found himself thinking about the photographs on the Reyes walls, the way they all leaned toward each other at the dinner table, the evident love in their modest home. And he thought about his own home, beautiful but often empty, his family scattered in their individual pursuits. The next morning, Richard called a meeting with his executive team. The presentation he'd been so worried about delivering in San Francisco was reassigned to his deputy. And then he did something that shocked everyone in the room. He announced he was taking a 2-week vacation, effective immediately, his first in over 5 years. "Family matters," he explained briefly, and left before anyone could ask questions. During those 2 weeks, Richard Harrington did many things he had postponed for too long. He attended his son's debate tournament. He flew to California to surprise his daughter for a weekend. He took his wife to the coastal cottage where they'd honeymooned 27 years earlier. And he continued to check in on the Reyes family, ensuring that Maria's treatments were proceeding smoothly. When he returned to work, Richard requested a meeting with the CEO. By the end of that meeting, Oakwood Properties had a new initiative, a scholarship program for the children of service staff and expanded health benefits for all employees, regardless of position. 3 months later, on a bright February morning, Richard received a text message from Lucia. "Mom's scan's clear." Doctors amazed by her response to treatment. "We're celebrating on Sunday. Please come." Richard attended that celebration dinner, and many more in the months that followed. His friendship with Alejandro, unlikely as it might have seemed that day in the executive bathroom, deepened into something genuine and valuable to them both. Their families began to intertwine in unexpected ways. Richard's wife Janet and Maria discovered a shared passion for gardening. Lucia began tutoring Christopher in Spanish. Richard used his connections to secure Lucia a part-time research position at Boston University, allowing her to begin taking classes while still helping support her family. 1 year after finding the wallet, Alejandro Reyes no longer worked as a janitor at Oakwood Tower. Instead, he managed the building's entire maintenance staff, a position created specifically to utilize his 15 years of knowledge about the building's operations. His salary had doubled, his hours were better, and most importantly, his health insurance now covered Maria's continuing treatments without question. On the anniversary of their meeting, Richard invited Alejandro to lunch in the executive dining room, a place Alejandro had cleaned many times but never eaten in. As they sat by the window overlooking Boston Harbor, Richard raised his water glass in a toast. "To lost wallets and found friendships," he said. Alejandro smiled, the lines around his eyes now more from laughter than worry. "And to knowing that good actions are never wasted, even when we think no one is watching." Later that afternoon, Alejandro stood in the lobby of Oakwood Tower, directing a new maintenance worker on the proper care of the marble floors. Through the revolving doors came a stream of office workers, bundled against the February cold. Most hurried past without a glance, focused on their destinations. But some more than before nodded hello. Some knew his name. And Alejandro, who had once moved through this building like a ghost, now stood solidly visible, his presence acknowledged, his contribution valued. As he demonstrated the proper figure-8 motion of the mop to the new employee, Alejandro thought about the wallet, about how one small act of ordinary honesty had somehow altered the trajectory of his family's life. He thought about Maria, now in remission, working part-time in a community garden program. He thought about Lucia, excelling in her pre-med courses, her future reclaimed. He thought about Miguel, who had been able to visit during Christmas because Richard had arranged an internship interview for him in Boston. And he thought about the countless invisible people who kept the world running, the janitors and dishwashers, the night security guards and early morning bakers, the taxi drivers and home health aides, all performing small acts of care and integrity that often went unnoticed. Sometimes, though, Alejandro now knew, those acts were seen. Sometimes they mattered in ways you could never predict. Sometimes returning a lost wallet wasn't just returning a wallet. It was opening a door to a future you couldn't have imagined. That evening, as Alejandro rode the elevator down at the end of his shift, Richard stepped in on the 10th floor. "Heading home?" Richard asked. "Yes," Alejandro replied. "Lucia is cooking tonight. She is trying to teach Miguel before he goes back to California." He laughed. "My kitchen will be disaster." "The best kind of disaster," Richard said with a smile. The elevator reached the lobby, and the two men walked out together. The immigrant janitor who had become a manager, and the executive who had become a friend. Their shadows stretching side by side across the marble floor that had once divided their worlds. Outside, Boston was turning golden in the late afternoon light. Alejandro paused for a moment, looking up at the tower where he had worked for so many years. Now seeing it differently, not as a monument to a dream beyond his reach, but as the unlikely place where his family's fate had changed. "See you Sunday?" he asked Richard. "Wouldn't miss it," Richard replied. "Janet's bringing her famous apple pie." They parted ways at the corner, Alejandro to the bus stop, Richard to his waiting car, but the distance between their lives had shrunk immeasurably. An immigrant janitor had returned a lost wallet, not realizing its owner would change his family's fate. And perhaps in ways less obvious but equally profound, a wealthy executive had found something he hadn't realized he'd lost. The understanding that true wealth isn't counted in dollars, but in connections, in kindness, in the courage to see beyond barriers that only exist because we allow them to. As his bus pulled away from the curb, Alejandro watched the city roll by, its lights beginning to twinkle against the darkening sky. Those same lights that had once marked only his hours of labor now sparked with possibility. They reminded him of something his father had told him long ago, back in Guatemala, that even the smallest light, if tended properly, can illuminate the darkest path. One small action, a wallet returned, a hand extended, a door held open, could change everything. Not always, perhaps, but sometimes, and sometimes was enough reason to keep the light burning.